Live from Chicago, it's Art with Anderson, the show that talks, teaches, and tackles all things art. Here's your host, Joe Anderson.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Art with Anderson and the Draw Along. So if you guys have been tuning in, this is the segment where I'm just going to be getting some things flowing for you guys, hopefully to inspire you to take action. If not, sit back, relax, and enjoy, and kind of feel the satisfaction that comes with just even watching art be made. So today, I'm going to be honest, it's always tough to come up with new ideas, especially to fill this show out. And what's interesting doing this, twice a week now and for 2 weeks straight every day, there was something about that prompt to get something ready for that next day that always keeps you going. But one of the things I've noticed is it's hard to keep that momentum up sometimes, especially on a nice day like today here in Chicago, where you're pressured to go outside and your mind is elsewhere. So I thought I'd go through a few activities, teach you this one weird trick if you clicked on that clickbaity title, but essentially a few strategies for starting to think about how to unplug that creative block that you might be facing. Even if you're thinking about writing, these are some relaxing activities, especially if you write by hand. There's a couple strategies I'm going to use. So I have a few materials here, but nothing too fancy. A pen, a couple markers, I have a mechanical pencil here. You can certainly use anything else that you'd like. And I see there are a couple people in the chat already, Rick, Kate, and Sue. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to dive right in. So I'm actually going to start I would recommend starting with a pen. Why? One thing I've noticed is you kind of don't pay attention to this, but when you're drawing with a pencil, there's a lot of friction. There's a kind of, you're grinding off that graphite. And compared to a ballpoint pen, it's a lot smoother. So we're going to do kind of a warm-up here. So if you have a blank sheet of paper, what I want you to focus on is your shoulder, your elbow, a little bit of your wrist here. We're going to focus on that shoulder and wrist first, so keep that hand solid. And we're just going to start with circles. Now, just flowing in and out, getting that shoulder movement is really more of a warm-up. For example, you wouldn't start, playing basketball without warming up. At least if you're of a certain age, you're a little bit more prone to getting hurt. This is good warm-up, but the thing is as you add more circles, you're doing two things. Number one, you're getting loose. You're starting to feel the flow of the pencil, get a feel for the materials, how hard to press. But what you're also doing is giving your mind something to latch onto. Circles are very kind of peaceful, closed forms that our eye loves to kind of follow the path. But notice how my hand doesn't even stop moving, even when I jump between. I'm kind of still doing this technique. All right. Now, if you can think of anything, let's say you had a totally blank slate and you're like, I don't know what on earth I should be drawing. Well, first of all, there's a lot of associations we have with circles that you could start to think about, especially when you start to vary the size. Try some smaller ones in there. Are do you notice yourself doing equally placed circles, or do you feel like some of them are overlapping? And right now, these are all over, they're kind of equally spaced. And maybe I put a dot in here to change it up. So there's a different scale. That's actually just this thing. We're making kind of a constellation here. Now, if you've watched a few of my other videos, you remember that starting with these general forms, even if I was drawing a real subject that I wanted to know more about, if you tuned in last time when we drew Patrick Star from SpongeBob, you know that drawing circles was kind of the first start. We're getting some nice mass in there. And nature is a really great model for us to learn from. Like planets are kind of a circle because of gravity. It's just pulling all in. All matter kind of attracts each other. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to unplug my mind thinking too much on like putting the pressure to create an idea. I'm just letting it flow. And as I fill up this space, maybe I put a few inside. Maybe I overlap a few. And right now I'm sticking with circles, but, I could maybe start adding some ovals here. Trying to get that, almost challenging your arm to just learn that shape, Take advantage of some muscle memory. Keep that arm moving. Notice how my hand has not stopped moving the entire time. And once you kind of commit to a shape, develop it. Maybe it kind of expands out. You start to feel like this kind of looks like a disc of some kind. But what I love about drawing with a ballpoint pen is you really can get surprisingly light lines. Now that we've had these closed forms, what I want you to try to do is let's just start to do some target practice. There's a couple ways you can do this. First one is to start to put a few dots on your paper. Now these dots are going to become targets, and what we're going to try to do is keep like one-shot lines to each dot. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to warm up. So I say picked 2 dots here, 1, 2, and I'm just going to go try to shoot that directly at it. One smooth movement. You know, sometimes you might decide, okay, I'm going to kind of practice a line and then just shoot it down. There we go. Just get those nice and quick. See how quickly you can do this. And if anyone is noticing that this kind of looks like some kind of planetary, I don't know, almost like Star Wars battle or something. That's what I'm starting to see. But notice I'm just putting things on the paper. What I'm doing is creating a kind of like a restaurant menu for my brain. I'm saying, okay, here are all of the options. I don't have to commit to all of them. But then the other one I'm going to try to do is start to look again at my circles and the lines. And what I want to do is try to figure out, maybe I can blend, get a perfect line that would kind of peel off of here and get a nice curve and flow into that line. We're creating tangents now. Kind of trying to inhabit these lines with our mind. Nice, smooth stuff. Everything is still sketchy. You know, maybe there's one that blends in from another. And now this is kind of a figure 8 infinity loop. So you might be wondering, how is this getting me an idea? Well, the thing is, I'm not worried about it. So much of creativity comes from what a lot of people talk about as the subconscious. So that's just stuff you're not really thinking about. And so I'm trusting that my mind will kind of help me get loosened up enough that I will be able to kind of turn this into an inspiration. And as you can see, I'm starting to see like this planetary thing. So I'm already starting to think about some association. So association would be a link. These are not planets, but somehow these symbols or this random mess of lines has started thinking, helped me think in a different way, an interdimensional way. You know, you could look at meditation as a similar type of exercise, or prayer, I guess. You could, you know, you're kind of putting your mind, you're kind of just putting it off, saying, hey, you know what, I'm not going to think too hard on this. I'm just going to do. Because a lot of times, creative block can come from anxiety of feeling like you have too much to do. And if this doesn't seem like a waste of time, like if you did this at your desk for your job, your boss might have something to say. There's another piece of research that says a lot of art therapy uses, especially people with, you know, anxiety issues, which we all have at certain points, right? And then also attention deficit disorder. Thing is, by doing repetitive motions and kind of rituals of where you're doing the same motion over and over, or very similar things, can help release dopamine in the brain, which has a kind of pleasureful effect. Now that I've started linking these things up, I'm going to start going back in with my straight lines, and I'm going to start to hunt for some shapes that I want to define a little bit more. So if I like a line, I'm going to darken it up, maybe move a little slower, and just add some emphasis here. Now, if you do this, I guarantee you're going to have another appreciation for abstract art. A lot of artists and people who like looking at art tend to start to get excited more about what we call figurative art, things that we can recognize. But if you spent enough time frustrated on just drawing things that we see, while that can be satisfying, if you just start to surrender to kind of like the joy of making marks, of these repeated rituals of sorts, kind of just the pleasure of drawing itself, exploring materials, that's how a lot of abstract art, or at least the kernels of it, begin. And some of those ideas actually come from what's normally random, right? Now, this is no longer just a kind of a mishmash of shapes. I'm starting to pick out lines that I like, and think of this as your, almost like if this was like a big area of nature and your job was to build a road through there. Start to imagine little challenges for yourself. Maybe it's got to go around certain features and avoid some of these like mountains, which we could see these circles as. So we're defining some shapes, and again, this is still just our warm-up, but I'm actually starting to like some of these things. Now, another thing that is really helpful for these, especially since you're moving a lot, there's something in art we call rhythm. Much like music, rhythm is something that is not only repetitive, but it has a structure and a pattern, and it gives us kind of something to latch onto and connect with in a piece. So just like a drummer might do, we're starting to establish the beat and the rhythm, not only of this drawing, but also kind of our mood, our mindset. So if you've noticed, this is a more philosophical session. That's one of the things that artists get to do, right? Is we get to think about life. Living the examined life, as they say, or a life of the mind. Now, there's one downside to this, is when you start taking this part too seriously. I'll be honest, when I was making a lot of abstract work, I still enjoy it. But if you start taking this too seriously, you can have the same effect. So kind of doing the opposite, maybe painting a flower or thinking of something that's in real life can bring you back down to earth here. As we draw planets, I'm talking about getting back down to earth. It's kind of ironic. Okay. So I have this kind of mess here of lines. So when we are thinking about lines, that's only one type of thing that we like to think of as artists, right? It's only one element of art. We also have shape, which is a two-dimensional thing, which we have plenty of here. But when we add color or value, or value is another word for shading, right? We can start to distinguish between these shapes. Now, we can also do that. If you still have your pen, I've done an exercise like this. But what I want you to do is let's pick kind of two similar lines. So I'm going to focus on this one and this one. Okay, so see how they're kind of similar curved lines. And what I want to do is between this line here and this shape, I'm going to try to do some contour hatching. So contour hatching, it's not just a straight line. We're going to actually try to follow this edge. So it almost rolls like this. I'm trying to keep them evenly spaced. And if you want to get really good at drawing quickly and confidently, so see how those kind of curve with the shape? Let's try to do it again up here. So I'm making my own coloring book. I'm making the boundary. And this one's a little different because this kind of starts off way over here and then it ends like this. So what I'm going to do is actually put the middle one in first and then split those down the middle. It's easier to get those curves right here. The reason I like this exercise is because we're literally creating a new reality. And as much as we like to think of art as something like the artist has to have an idea ahead of time and then bring it into reality, that's not always how it works. Sometimes the materials can guide you and start to create spaces that you start to explore with a drawing or even just writing. So while I'm doing this, I do want to talk about something else that's really helped me, and that is automatic writing. I won't be demonstrating that here, but if you're looking for a challenge, you're not comfortable doing the drawing exercise, which is more automatic, what I want you to try to do is get out a sheet of paper and a pen or pencil and do automatic writing. What that is that you don't come up with an idea you literally just set a timer, and then you write for a set amount of time. Say even 1 minute. Just write. Even if it's just the same word over and over, believe it or not, you can actually start developing and just kind of getting your thoughts onto the page. It's that step of just getting something on there that will really help you get moving. So as you can see, I'm letting this kind of build up with line work here. And that can help us a lot. But look how much I'm drawing straight from that arm. Keeping those lines nice and straight. Using this as kind of a target range here. You can start to see these discs forming, but I've had enough of this pen. Maybe I can start to switch to another material. I mentioned that pen is going to flow. We want everything to flow here, and a lot of people make the mistake of creativity as coming up with a unique idea once. Really, it's about getting into a flow state. An artist has to force themselves to get into it, but the word force is a little bit off because anytime you try to force something, it almost makes it even harder to do. So think of this as loosening up as much as possible and kind of literally set out to make mistakes because they kind of give us something for our mind to focus on. So here I have my marker, and I'm going to just kind of start to focus on picking up shapes with this that are independent. Okay? Especially just some odd ones. Now there's another part that we're going to be focusing on, and that's going to be creating an association map. And what that is essentially like if you've ever seen, in a movie, like a psychologist will do an ink blot test. We're setting up our own ink blot here. It doesn't mean anything yet, right? It's literally just random strokes on a paper. But what we're doing is we're subconsciously allowing our mind to trace these pathways and start to see forms that you can start to recognize. Now, these are very organized shapes, very geometric. There's a lot of curves. We don't have a lot of scribbles in there. So what I'm going to be doing now is to introduce a little bit of organic lines. Okay, now for this one, I am going to use a pencil, if I can find one. Nope. Well, I'm just going to use the pen again so I can do it nice and light. What I want you to do is start to experiment with making chaotic strokes. So what we're going to do is just kind of take the pen at kind of a ridiculous thing, hold it back like this, and I want you to practice wiggling it in random motions and kind of letting it go across here. So this is coming from my wrist. You can do long squiggly lines. You can break it up if you want. Maybe it's just like an area. Maybe it stays in one. I'm not hardly even looking at this. I'm looking at the screen right now. It might seem like we're ruining some of that stuff, but actually, once we pull away from the idea of perfection, we're going to be willing to take more risks, which is associated with some better ideas. All right, now, instead of going into any of these shapes, what I'm going to try to do is keep my chaotic strokes inside of one of the boxes that I made. So I'm just trying to really scribble in here, but keep it inside the lines. Believe it or not, our mind has a very powerful circuit in there that helps us find very geometric shapes. So even if I were to draw, say, 4 dots like this, that's technically a square. Most people could recognize that very quickly. And the thing with that is you want to stay away from that if you're trying to create natural forms, right? So I've started to blend this thing in a little bit. All right, let's go back. But what I'm going to use now is some of that organic stuff to start shading in, maybe with this pen again. Let's do some cross-hatching inside of one of those shapes. So we're giving it some form. We're trying to do parallel lines now. And you're going to be surprised. This starts to look more geometric, almost like a clear structure. But if you follow your more organic lines, there's going to be a pleasing rhythm to that. So I'm choosing to do vertical lines inside of these. And if you're starting to get bored with these colors, certainly go ahead and grab some colored pencils or watercolor, and you can start to do the same thing. Start to color in some of these areas. I do feel like I want to flatten some of these organic shapes out for some reason. And then we're going to just really dive in to start developing some of these shapes. So what I'd like you to think about is we've created this space here that could contain any multitude of objects. But what I want you to do now is switch over from that free kind of flowing state to a little bit more analytical thinking, okay? What are some things that these forms remind you of? Because that's what we're going to try to do, is we're going to try to turn these shapes into objects. And we're going to be inspired by the chaos of this form to develop it a little bit into a new one. Now, since I'm thinking of space, I want you to see this shape right here. I'm seeing a rocket ship kind of shooting out of whatever this is. So I'm going to be adding some fins here. You know, shade them up a little bit. Maybe we can add, you know, this kind of looks like a missile or something. I do it first in pen, and I can always establish some of it later. Maybe even add a little nozzle at the back here. All right, so I can see this. You're going to also, when you do this and challenge yourself to see forms within chaos, you're taking advantage of a very powerful part of your brain that it was designed to see and to complete images, especially faces. So that's another thing we can look for, is we can look for what are starting to be face-like objects. So let's see if we have any faces hidden in here. And what I try to do is find a grouping of 3 objects. So let's see. I see something here and here. I don't know, that one's not working as much as I like. Let's see. Here's 2 eyes I see. So I'm going to start with that. And then there's this curve that could be kind of like a mouth. I'm going to kind of turn this curve into more of a lip. So this is going to be a weird kind of cartoon alien guy. So here's the eyes. Maybe he's actually grabbing this ball. I want to give him some kind of weird looking ears. Almost looks like a demented Pikachu. So I'm following some of the curves that I have. And we're letting the space define these things. If I don't like it, I can move on. I also see what looks kind of like a ghost here. I like this form. Maybe it's an alien. I'm actually going to develop this form right here. And we're going to say, oh, this is really cool. It's almost got this mouth here that looks open. I'm going to darken this up. And we're just going to say that this guy is like a strange little alien. Now, if you are getting a random result yourself, that's the point. We just want to get this thing flowing. But as you notice, like we're 20 minutes into this episode, and now we have content to deal with. I'm already starting to think like, oh, you know what? Even though maybe I usually paint like realistic portraits, it'd be kind of funny to maybe think about aliens Or and maybe actually, now that I think about it, I was watching Close Encounters with the Third Kind last night, so maybe there's something underneath there. But since I'm getting this weird like alien feel, this outer space, I'm starting to see, yeah, this spiral shape really take form. Yeah, maybe this is like a wormhole, and it's almost like splintering apart. And these things are getting sucked in. Now, the other thing that's really cool about something like this is that once you start to see these forms, it will challenge you to practice your drawing skills in a way that will make you better. So here I see, I'm going to try to make this look like a black hole that's getting sucked in. So I'm kind of creating that weird thing over here. So it's almost like it's getting sucked in. And there's this planet that's getting sucked in there. So this must have been like a spacecraft collision or something that is really pulling these things apart. And that pen is really good for doing the same thing, right? Maybe this one, we're starting to see some things come out of this black hole. Maybe these kind of came out from down here. And we could certainly go back in with our marker. Now, again, I'm trying to keep this stuff flowing, and we've done a lot of different things to get here. We've started off with circles. We did some connecting lines, some target practice. We did some cross hatching, some contour hatching, and now we have this whole scene to illustrate. Now, you might think that this is a little bit, chaotic, but you never know, because the thing is now that it's out there, now that you have it described in your picture, it's yours to work with. So this little alien guy looks like he's having a hard time. I'm going to make it look like he has some shiny eyes almost. A little reflection. We could even bring it out a little bit more. So there's a little bit of drama in here. We have some characters. I can start to go in and start shading. This is now the shape. That black can be helpful in establishing those forms. So if you have a marker, this is kind of when you can use that to get something to pop out a little bit more, even correct the stuff if it's a wider pen. So my whole claim was to learn this one weird trick. This is definitely a weird trick, so I hope you're okay with that. But the one thing that is universal amongst all types of, ways to overcome creative block is to just commit to making marks, commit to having something to respond to. Our brain is not very good at coming up with ideas out of nowhere. It's actually very good at responding to different stimuli. We're not the best at just popping into, like a non-existent space. Even in a dream, we're working with some things that we've witnessed. Our brain is putting together things from our experience that are combining in a unique way. It's very difficult to dream a place or an object or a situation that you haven't experienced before, at least in all of its parts. So you could look at this as almost like a dream construction. We're using existing things to guide the creation of a new environment, right? Even if it's strange, grotesque, bizarre, we're following it wherever it goes. And that can lead to some kind of funny moments. So maybe this guy is kind of holding on to this little space launcher thing. maybe you have a name for these kind of characters you develop. But if you ever notice that many cartoons, if you try to draw them, they actually have a pretty similar set of objects in them, or songs, right, there's only 12 notes in the scale. How is it that artists come up with unique combinations of those? You'd think they'd run out. But that's the beauty of these kind of unique combinations. There's an infinite way to combine these elements, and every drawing that you begin, you're basically dumping out your self-conscious, and you are just allowing that to speak through your mark making. It's not to say that every mark that you make is worth $1 million, or it's going to mean that it's the masterpiece that you create without thinking, but it might be the nugget that kind of gets you started on that journey. This is kind of a space that I wouldn't have imagined or set out to explore, but it's certainly full of drama here. Like I'm seeing now, maybe this is a, this wormhole that's kind of transporting different things. I'm not even a sci-fi fan, really. It's just, I'm forcing my mind into places that it normally wouldn't go. So we have a lot going on in here, and I'll take a break from this one because it certainly is kind of specific. But notice a few things before I switch it up. Number one is that we have a couple different line weights. Okay, so what a line weight would be is compare the thickness of the pen with the black marker. Line weight will help your eyes create a more interesting, or you'll be creating a more interesting image, and we'll be able to establish some forms. Think of it as like the darker lines are pointing to areas that you have picked as an artist that look like something. And if you want to get philosophical, that's what we do as painters if we're trying to emulate something we see in nature. Okay. Now, there's another thing that I like doing that's a little bit less based on lines here at the beginning, and that can be kind of fun. But what I do have is some iced tea here. And this one is kind of fun. I would find myself doing this. I used to be a teacher, and every once in a while, if I was bored, I always had a trusty cup of coffee on my desk, or tea, keep me caffeinated and focused enough to get through the day with, I think I've had usually like 120 kids per day, which was a lot of work. But what I love about this thing is if you take, let's say you got some iced tea or some coffee, just want you to start making some stains. Even if they're just not, we want to make some ink blots. We're just messing with this. Now my paper is kind of turned down right now, so it's kind of running all over the place. Good thing I didn't do it with coffee because I got some on my jeans. But some of these drips can be a really great organic starting point, even if they're very subtle. Now, you could do this with ink, but what I would do is dilute the ink a little bit, because if it's too dark, you might not be able to kind of see these things as they, or they become too dark, just like the marker lines. We're trying to start with something that's relatively light. I'm actually going to shake this out a little bit. Now, I'm going to draw while it's still wet, and we'll see what happens. Sometimes you can get your ink to run into these things depending on what kind of marker you're using. If it's water-based, you'll get some really cool bleeding effects. Not like bleeding like an injury, but like bleeding like the wetness kind of pulls it in there like watercolor. So let's come up with some ideas here. Now, I am going to start with my pen, and I'm just going to be starting to trace some of these shapes now. I don't have to kind of keep it in there. I'm just using them as starter forms. Starting to notice they almost look like trees, especially these drips. So I'm just kind of punching in some lines. The one thing I would avoid is while it's wet, try not to color into the wet area if you have some thin, if you're working with computer paper. You really want to be careful not to tear it. Some of these shapes look like trees, some of them look like something else. We'll see what they turn into. But we're going to use the same idea, is we're giving our eye something to respond to instead of putting the pressure on ourselves to come up with a completely new idea. But finding, using the way a fluid or a liquid flows is a great way to find natural stimuli to respond to. And by practicing this same thing, I'm using these kind of quick strokes to kind of mimic the flow of that tea, that liquid. I'm not trying to get too crazy with it. Coffee is really good if you put maybe stain. It's a little bit darker. But you can already see there's almost like this mystical scene. I'm almost picturing like we're looking through some trees at a lake. So I'm going to put these trees in just to help us do it. I love how these little branches kind of came off with those drips. I used to make a lot of paintings that were literally just, what I'd do is I'd wrap the canvas in threads and then drip paint from the top, and the threads would kind of pull the paint into different directions. I'll have to post some of those pictures later. But if you are a watercolorist, you will definitely kind of be familiar with this rhythm of how the water flows, but it's almost uncanny how this thing turns into like a tree, especially maybe like a dead one that has these kind of branches. Now, another thing with this stuff, normally I'd say keep this sketch. Well, you might not ever look at it again. A better way is, especially if you have a smartphone, obviously, you can store a picture of it. And then, if something really inspires me, or there's just a little passage of a piece that I do off of one of these chaos things, what I'll do is snap a photo, and then even if I come back to it in Photoshop or in Procreate, one of those digital apps, you can use that as part of your drawing, something to bring in that brings natural rhythm. And you can actually also use them as texture that you could overlay onto your piece. There's all sorts of artists that literally spend all their day making different brush strokes and textures, and you can build a digital brush out of that same random pattern you found in kind of a more natural area. So this is starting to kind of take form into, I don't know if you guys see this. So here's this, these trees in the foreground. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to define some shapes that are behind it, using these as shapes that I won't overlap. I think I got most of it. But the challenge is to try to turn this into something. Now, this portion kind of reminds me of like a house. So I'm going to say these are kind of some windows. Maybe it's a cabin off in the woods. I try not to do really straight lines, especially when I'm drawing, or I should say continuous lines. See how they're all kind of dotted? I'm just kind of sketching some things in here. See how it kind of slants like perspective. I don't know. And then I'm going to just put some little chaotic strokes in here, maybe some bushes. And this is going to be kind of up on a hill, I think. So here's that house. We're looking through these branches. And we can always add some more marker later. But what I'm going to do is kind of draw a lake. So I'm just drawing kind of a shoreline here. Being careful not to run into any of those trees that I made. And then maybe I'll put a dock here so we can tell that there's maybe a lake here. So I'm actually imagining this setting. Little posts into the water. See, now you can see another example of how this really pays off. but what I'm doing is respecting those lines that I drew as solid shapes so I don't get too confused with what's going on. So now I have this little dock. Maybe we'll put a little rowboat over here. Now, you might say that, okay, this takes a little bit too much drawing skill. Well, this is how I got my drawing skill. So, practicing letting your imagination run with an object is half the battle, right? It certainly come back, but now we have this cool little dock, and then see the planks are going to kind of come in between these trees. I didn't even draw an outline, but now you can tell that something is there. So I'm letting those other details reveal that this is now a tree. Oh, Joe, good idea. It looks like bamboo. That's right. Okay, so we have this, we're looking down on this shoreline here. Maybe it kind of goes over here, but we start to see the hill, which is pretty steep, comes down through here. So there is a little bit of a shoreline. We're looking pretty far down. My perspective might be a little bit off, but let's say there's a kind of a snaking little, there's some stairs that come down. It's definitely a curvy set of steps. I'm just definitely thinking of like a very Bob Ross style place where you'd want to hang out. Maybe you can make some beautiful paintings. But you're starting to see this little place where we can kind of create some nature. Now, the other thing that you could also start to do is, maybe put another layer of stains on there. Or if you were doing watercolor, this is your setup, right? We've created a completely unique space. We've turned these stains into something that's recognizable. And we're really just, we're activating our imagination and now creating a setting for this, these ideas to take hold. So one last thing that I really want to share with you, and this is a technique that I've used, kind of started off as a joke, but I found that it was actually pretty successful, especially with my middle school students who struggled with this, because we are good at imagining things when we're prompted to do something, right? And like I mentioned before, it's all about taking the pressure off. So one way to do that is, number one, to make it funny, or the stakes are lower, like silly, I would say is a better word. Get a little bit of chaos in there, which we did on that first one, or be very specific. Okay, so what I would do is walk somebody through this very specific exercise, and it said, start off, close your eyes, and I want you to imagine yourself in a hallway with doors on each side, but there's one door at the end. I want you to walk down the hallway and stop in front of a door of your choice. Now, before you open that door, I want you to imagine turning that doorknob, that the lights are off, and when you flip the lights on, you're going to see a table. What is on that table? And for everyone, it's going to be different. But if you isolate it to one object, somebody will come up with one specific thing that wasn't anybody else's idea. And it's not necessarily about, that's why people think of these ideas as something given from like a higher power sometimes. It's because we almost are amazed that we're capable of thinking of something so specific. And really just an idea is just a specific image that we can recognize. Because just like a sculpture made by a master out of a block of marble, right? An infinite variation of sculptures could have emerged, or it could have been left in a quarry. But the idea is how clear you can see something. And if you limit the distractions and focus on creating something very specific, even if it's just by responding to chaos that you see on here, that's going to get you off onto a completely new tangent or creative exploration. Now, the last thing I'll say before I finish this thing up is I want to thank you guys for tuning in. This has definitely been kind of a far out journey for me as well. We've gone from outer space to kind of a backwoods country retreat. And I'm really glad that you guys stuck with me on this, and I hope it'll be useful for you, or at least relaxing. But I also do want to encourage you to like and subscribe. If you subscribe, be sure to hit that notification button. So that way, if I have a live cast, especially if it's not one of the scheduled ones, you won't miss out, or at least you'll be able to be reminded when that goes live so you can watch it later. But as always, if you have ideas or requests, please comment either in the chat, which I love getting to talk to you guys, and then also in the comments below. And then lastly, I'm looking forward to inviting a friend of mine and animator, filmmaker, skateboarder, really creative and talkative and funny guy, going to be calling in on In Profile, my new interview series, and that's going to be next Saturday. So I want you guys to tune in, and hopefully you enjoyed this one today. And if you do this creative challenge, I'd love to see the spaces that you go to in taking on these creative exercises. So I hope you've enjoyed this. This has been Art with Anderson, and I will see you guys on Wednesday for our next episode. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.